Cajamarca, 1532. Francisco Pizarro walks into the heart of the Inca world with fewer than 200 Spaniards and decides to do what a conventional commander would call suicidal: invite Emperor Atahualpa to a feast, then try to seize him in a single violent minute. It works. Thousands of Atahualpa's attendants are cut down, and the emperor is taken alive. An empire with tens of thousands of soldiers begins to fracture from one captured man. But why did this succeed at all? What kind of strategy treats diplomacy as a kill zone? And what hidden assumption about power makes an emperor worth more than an army? Because Cajamarca was not a battle. It was a system attack, and it carried a price that still stains the logic of victory. This episode is not about how a small Spanish force defeated a larger Inca host. That framing is too shallow and dangerously misleading. The real strategic question is far more unsettling. How did Francisco Pizarro design a situation where military strength became irrelevant, and authority itself became the battlefield? At Cajamarca, the objective was not territorial gain, annihilation, or even tactical dominance. The objective was to seize the operating system of the Inca state in one move. Atahualpa was not merely a ruler. He was the single node through which legitimacy, command, and collective action flowed. Remove that node, and the system does not immediately fight back. It stalls. It hesitates. It waits for permission that will never come. This is why Cajamarca qualifies as a genuinely unorthodox strategy. It did not aim to defeat an army. It aimed to collapse a structure of power by exploiting assumptions embedded deep within it, assumptions about ritual safety, centralized authority, and the behavior of victors. But here is the danger. This strategy only works if every fragile assumption holds at once. If even one breaks, the result is not a narrow defeat. It is immediate annihilation. And that raises the next question we must confront: what kind of strategic environment makes a decision like Cajamarca even imaginable in the first place? Because to understand the trap, we must first map the pressures that made it necessary. To understand why Cajamarca happened, we have to strip away the myth of confidence and look at the actual strategic position Francisco Pizarro was in. Not the image history prefers. The real one. On paper, the situation bordered on absurd. Fewer than 200 Spaniards, operating thousands of kilometers from reliable reinforcement, deep inside a vast empire they barely understood. No secure supply lines. No friendly rear. No ability to absorb losses. One failed encounter would not mean retreat. It would mean erasure. Pizarro did not control terrain. He did not control time. And he did not control escalation. Every variable favored the Inca Empire. Atahualpa commanded a state that could mobilize tens of thousands of warriors on short notice. The empire had just emerged from a brutal civil war, which paradoxically strengthened Atahualpa's position. Victory over his rival Huáscar had eliminated internal competitors. Authority was concentrated, not diffused. That concentration would later prove decisive, but at this stage, it appeared to make Atahualpa unassailable. This asymmetry created a brutal strategic equation for the Spanish. A conventional campaign was impossible. There was no path to attrition. No terrain to trade for time. No political coalition to build gradually. Every normal option led to the same conclusion: delay favored the Inca. Prolonged exposure meant discovery, encirclement, and destruction. Time, therefore, was not a neutral variable. It was hostile. Logistics made this worse. Spanish forces depended on limited local extraction and tenuous coastal links. They could not sustain a prolonged standoff. The longer they remained intact, the more likely it became that the Inca state would adapt, learn, and respond with overwhelming force. From Atahualpa's perspective, the picture looked very different. The Inca emperor had just won a decisive internal war. He was at the height of his authority. His armies were battle-hardened, his legitimacy reinforced by victory. When reports arrived about a small group of foreigners on the coast, they did not register as an existential threat. They were an anomaly. Curious, perhaps dangerous in limited ways, but strategically marginal. This perception mattered. Atahualpa did not need to rush. He did not need to mobilize fully. He could afford to observe, to test, to engage diplomatically. His system rewarded patience because its default response to uncertainty was absorption, not preemption. Here we reach the first critical blind spot. Atahualpa's power was absolute, but it was also singular. Decision-making authority did not cascade laterally. It flowed downward from one source. That structure worked extraordinarily well in large-scale mobilization. It worked less well in moments of sudden ambiguity, where initiative from below might have been required. Cajamarca exploited this exact tension. The meeting at Cajamarca was not framed as a military engagement. It was framed as a ritual encounter. Ritual mattered deeply in the Inca world. It defined hierarchy, legitimacy, and order. Entering a ritual space implied a temporary suspension of violence, not because violence was unthinkable, but because it was socially and cosmologically regulated. Pizarro understood this at least intuitively. He did not need to understand Inca theology in depth. He only needed to understand that rituals create expectations, and expectations create predictable behavior. For Atahualpa, attending Cajamarca without a full armed formation was not recklessness. It was consistency. He was asserting dominance by refusing to treat the Spaniards as military equals. He was signaling confidence. That confidence was not irrational. It was grounded in every prior experience of power he had ever known. Meanwhile, Pizarro faced his own internal pressures. His force was small, fractious, and far from united in enthusiasm. Any prolonged indecision risked internal collapse. Morale depended on momentum. Momentum depended on action. And action had to be decisive enough to change the entire strategic environment in a single stroke. This is where the map becomes clear. Pizarro could not win by playing the long game. Atahualpa did not need to rush and therefore had no incentive to strike preemptively. Both sides were rational within their frameworks. And yet those frameworks were incompatible. The Spaniards needed a discontinuity. A moment that rewrote the rules instantly. The Inca Emperor believed he was entering a controlled interaction, one where escalation could be managed if necessary. He did not expect that the interaction itself was the weapon. That mismatch of expectations is the strategic fault line Cajamarca exploited. The battlefield was not the square. The battlefield was the assumption about what the square was for. And once that assumption was locked in, the rest followed with terrifying speed. But here is the paradox: according to every military doctrine of the era, this should never have been attempted at all. Every military doctrine of the early 16th century would have rejected Cajamarca outright. Not as risky. Not as aggressive. But as strategically incoherent. Doctrine favors leverage that compounds. Numbers that absorb error. Distance that buys time. Authority that escalates force when plans begin to fray. Cajamarca offered none of that. It offered compression. A single moment. A single target. A single chance. A conventional commander, facing Pizarro's situation, would have chosen one of three paths. The first is consolidation. Secure coastal positions. Build alliances slowly. Learn the political map. Avoid provoking the center of power until strength accumulates. This is patient conquest. It trades speed for survivability. The second is intimidation by demonstration. Strike peripheral targets. Display technological superiority. Force concessions without committing to a decisive engagement. This path relies on fear diffusing outward. The third is avoidance. Withdraw. Preserve the force. Report the threat. Return later with overwhelming manpower and institutional backing. All three are rational. All three preserve optionality. And all three fail in this environment. Consolidation fails because time works against the Spaniards. The longer they remain visible, the more the Inca system adapts. Curiosity turns into categorization. Categorization turns into mobilization. Once the process begins, there is no defensive position small Spanish units can hold. Intimidation fails because fear does not propagate upward fast enough in centralized systems. Peripheral shock does not automatically threaten the core. It alerts it. And alertness is lethal when the core controls massive reserves. Withdrawal fails because it forfeits initiative entirely. The next encounter will not be on Spanish terms. It will be on terrain chosen by an empire that has learned. Doctrine assumes the possibility of maneuver. Cajamarca existed precisely because maneuver was gone. This is the first doctrinal fracture. The environment had eliminated all safe strategies. Pizarro was not choosing between good and bad options. He was choosing between immediate extinction and delayed extinction. Doctrine does not prepare commanders for that. The second fracture lies in doctrine's treatment of authority. Most military theory assumes that leadership loss degrades effectiveness gradually. A commander is killed. A deputy takes over. Orders continue. Control degrades, but it does not collapse instantly. That assumption holds in distributed command systems. It does not hold when legitimacy itself is centralized. In the Inca state, authority was not merely administrative. It was cosmological. The emperor was not just a general. He was the point where law, ritual, and command converged. Orders without that convergence carried less force. Initiative without sanction carried risk. Doctrine does not teach how to exploit that kind of structure because most militaries are designed to avoid it. They train for resilience. The Inca system trained for obedience. Pizarro did not defeat an army. He defeated a governance model. This is why doctrine misreads Cajamarca as a bold ambush. An ambush is tactical. Cajamarca was architectural. It attacked the load-bearing column of the entire structure. The third doctrinal failure concerns risk tolerance. Standard military planning distributes risk across phases. Advance. Secure. Engage. Exploit. Each phase absorbs error from the last. Cajamarca compressed all risk into one instant. There was no second phase. No fallback. If Atahualpa refuses to enter the square, the plan collapses. If his escort remains armed, the plan collapses. If a single Inca unit reacts autonomously, the plan collapses. Doctrine teaches commanders to avoid plans that hinge on so many uncontrollable variables. And doctrine is correct. Which raises the central contradiction. If Cajamarca violates doctrine at every level, why was it attempted? Because doctrine assumes survivability as a baseline objective. Pizarro's situation had already stripped that away. His objective was not to win sustainably. It was to force a transformation of the strategic environment so radical that survival became possible afterward. That distinction matters. Cajamarca was not a plan to win a war. It was a plan to escape strategic suffocation. This reframes the entire decision. Pizarro was not ignoring doctrine out of arrogance. He was operating outside its applicability. He faced a binary environment. Either the system changed immediately, or it consumed him. Doctrine also fails to account for asymmetry of perception. Atahualpa evaluated the Spaniards through a framework built on scale. He saw a small group. He saw no mass. No logistical footprint. No territorial claim. Doctrine told him this was not a threat worth treating as equal. Pizarro evaluated Atahualpa through a framework built on centrality. He did not see armies. He saw a single decision-maker whose capture could freeze the entire system. Each side followed its internal logic. Only one logic mapped onto reality. Doctrine prepares leaders to fight peers. Cajamarca was not peer conflict. It was system mismatch. And here lies the most dangerous insight. Cajamarca only works when doctrine fails on both sides simultaneously. The attacker must be willing to abandon every principle designed to keep armies alive. The defender must be so confident in those same principles that he never imagines they could be inverted. That overlap window is vanishingly small. Which is why Cajamarca is not a repeatable tactic. It is an event that exists at the intersection of desperation, misperception, and structural vulnerability. And yet, someone still had to articulate the decision. Someone had to say, in a room full of armed men, that they would stake everything on a single moment of violence disguised as ceremony. Someone had to argue that seizing one man mattered more than killing thousands. That argument did not go uncontested. Because the most dangerous part of Cajamarca was not the ambush itself, but the decision to attempt it. The decision at Cajamarca did not emerge fully formed. It crystallized under pressure, through hesitation, disagreement, and a narrowing set of options that made conventional judgment irrelevant. Inside the Spanish camp, there was no illusion of safety. Officers understood the imbalance. They also understood that once Atahualpa's full military apparatus focused on them, no discipline or technology would matter. What they debated was not whether the situation was dangerous. They debated which kind of danger was survivable. One camp favored caution. Delay the meeting. Demand guarantees. Keep distance. Every instinct trained in European warfare leaned this way. Distance meant reaction time. Reaction time meant survival. But distance also meant visibility. And visibility meant the Inca system would eventually classify them correctly and respond decisively. Another camp argued for initiative. Not aggression in the conventional sense, but initiative that redefined the interaction. If the encounter could be shaped tightly enough, if Atahualpa could be isolated psychologically and physically, then numbers would cease to function as power. This argument was deeply unsettling. It required accepting a core premise that most commanders resist, that the safest moment to strike is the moment that appears least threatening. Pizarro aligned with this view not because it was elegant, but because it was the only path that offered a discontinuity. He was not seeking advantage. He was seeking rupture. 3 assumptions anchored the decision. The first assumption was about authority. Atahualpa was not simply a leader issuing orders. He was the source of legitimacy. Without him present and active, subordinates were unlikely to improvise coordinated violence. The system did not reward autonomous escalation. It punished it. This was not guesswork. It was inferred from how the empire governed. Command flowed downward. Ritual reinforced obedience. Deviating from sanctioned action carried personal and cosmological risk. Pizarro's plan depended on freezing that flow. The second assumption concerned ritual space. Cajamarca was not a battlefield. It was a controlled environment defined by protocol. Who could carry weapons? Where people stood? When speech occurred? These constraints were not incidental. They were predictable. Pizarro understood that ritual creates choreography. And choreography creates timing. If violence was introduced at the exact moment the ritual shifted from dialogue to refusal, shock would be maximized and reaction minimized. The third assumption was psychological. Atahualpa had just won a civil war. Victors rarely expect traps from the defeated. Confidence was not arrogance here. It was consistency. Every prior interaction had confirmed Atahualpa's dominance. Pizarro bet that this pattern would hold one more time. Each assumption was fragile. If authority had been more distributed, the capture would have triggered immediate counterattack. If ritual had allowed armed presence, the square would have become lethal for the Spaniards. If Atahualpa had treated uncertainty as threat rather than curiosity, the meeting would never have occurred. These were not small risks. They were existential. Which is why internal opposition mattered. Some officers understood that this plan removed all buffers. There would be no second chance. No fallback. Once initiated, the only outcomes were total success or immediate destruction. What ultimately tipped the balance was not confidence, but convergence. Every alternative path led to slow strangulation. Every delay increased the probability of encirclement. Waiting felt prudent. It was also fatal. So the decision narrowed. Not because it was optimal, but because it was the last option that changed the rules instead of submitting to them. The mechanics of the plan reflected this logic. The Spaniards did not seek a prolonged exchange. They sought proximity. Close enough to identify Atahualpa physically. Close enough that his capture would be unmistakable. Close enough that his sudden removal would be visible to everyone present. This is critical. The goal was not secrecy. It was spectacle. The shock had to be undeniable. The moment Atahualpa was seized, the square needed to understand that something unprecedented had occurred. Here lies another contradiction. Most deception strategies rely on concealment. Cajamarca relied on exposure. The violence was meant to be seen, not hidden. Its function was not merely to incapacitate, but to paralyze decision-making across the social hierarchy. The plan also accounted for internal discipline. Every Spaniard had to act simultaneously. Premature violence would reveal intent too early. Delayed violence would allow adaptation. The margin for error was measured in seconds. This demanded an unusual form of command cohesion. Not flexible initiative, but absolute synchronization. Each individual's survival depended on everyone else acting at the same moment. It was a design that inverted typical military values. Autonomy was a liability. Obedience was survival. And still, one question lingered. Even if Atahualpa was captured, what then? The plan did not include a long-term solution. It created leverage, not stability. It assumed that the shock of capture would buy time. That time could be converted into control through negotiation, intimidation, and manipulation. This was not guaranteed. It was hoped. That hope reveals the final risk. Cajamarca was not a strategy built for endurance. It was a strategy built to force improvisation afterward. Pizarro accepted that whatever followed would be messy, violent, and morally compromised. But he also accepted that there would be a followed at all. Without this decision, there would be nothing left to manage. And that brings us to the most dangerous phase of all. Because designing a rupture is one thing. Executing it in real time, under pressure, with no margin for correction, is another entirely. And once the decision was made, the plan entered its most fragile state, contact with reality. Once the decision was locked, the plan entered a phase where intelligence, courage, and discipline mattered less than timing. At Cajamarca, execution was not about movement across space. It was about controlling a minute of human behavior. The Spanish force did not deploy like an army. It hit like a mechanism waiting to snap. Men were placed inside buildings surrounding the square. Cavalry was concealed, compressed into positions that allowed a sudden burst of motion. Infantry held tight, weapons ready but unseen. Artillery, limited as it was positioned for sound as much as effect. Noise would matter more than casualties. This was not preparation for a battle. It was preparation for a neurological event. The square itself was the critical asset. Open enough to draw Atahualpa in. Confined enough to limit movement once chaos began. The geometry mattered. Escape routes were narrow. Visibility would collapse under dust, bodies, and panic. Every detail was tuned toward one outcome: paralysis. Atahualpa's arrival followed the logic Pizarro had anticipated. He entered with a large retinue, confident, unarmored, treating the encounter as a demonstration of authority rather than a confrontation. This was not negligence. It was political theater. An emperor did not arrive bristling with weapons to meet a curiosity. That choice sealed the square. The initial exchange was deliberate and slow. Words mattered less than posture. The Spaniards needed proximity. They needed Atahualpa fully committed to the interaction, not poised to withdraw. Here the plan nearly failed. Ritual is not static. It breathes. It can bend. If Atahualpa had sensed disrespect too early, if the exchange had escalated verbally before physical positioning was complete, the moment would have passed. This was the first micro-twist. The tension inside the Spanish positions intensified as seconds stretched. Every delay increased exposure. Every breath risked detection. Discipline under this kind of pressure is rare, because nothing appears to be happening, and yet everything depends on what happens next. The trigger was not violence. It was refusal. When Atahualpa rejected the symbolic demand placed before him, the ritual shifted. That shift was the window. Not because it justified violence, but because it broke the expected script. The signal was given. What followed was not a fight. It was a system shock. Cannon fire detonated the soundscape. Horses burst into the square. Steel appeared where none had existed moments before. The sudden density of movement collapsed orientation. People could not tell where threats originated. Commands could not propagate. This was the second micro-twist. The chaos did not spread evenly. It folded inward toward Atahualpa. The Spaniards did not attack outward. They drove toward the center. Every motion was about reaching one man. This is where execution risk peaked. If Atahualpa was killed accidentally, the leverage vanished. If he escaped, the Spaniards would be surrounded within minutes. If even one unit of Inca attendants organized coherently, the square would become a slaughterhouse for the attackers. This was the narrowest edge. Accounts suggest that the physical struggle around Atahualpa was intense and confused. He was surrounded by his own attendants, who attempted to shield him without weapons. Spanish soldiers had to push through bodies to reach him alive. The plan required restraint in the middle of violence. That is a rare demand. Eventually, Atahualpa was seized. At that instant, the strategic objective was achieved. But the danger did not disappear. It transformed. The square was still filled with thousands of people. Panic does not end because a leader is captured. Panic accelerates. The Spaniards now faced a new risk, escalation beyond control. Killing continued, not because it was necessary, but because stopping violence in the middle of a shock event is extraordinarily difficult. The plan had not included a clear mechanism for de-escalation. That omission mattered. This is an uncomfortable truth of unorthodox strategies. They often solve one problem while creating another. Logistically, the Spaniards were still exposed. They were now holding a prisoner whose value depended entirely on keeping him alive and visible. They needed to extract him from the square, secure him, and communicate his capture before the Inca system could reorient. That communication was as important as the capture itself. Word had to spread that Atahualpa was alive and held. Alive meant leverage. Dead would mean martyrdom and immediate retaliation. The Spaniards understood this instinctively, even if they had not articulated it formally. The third micro-twist came after the square fell silent. Atahualpa did not order an immediate counterattack. He attempted to negotiate. This reaction validated Pizarro's core assumption. Authority remained centralized. Even in captivity, Atahualpa was treated as the decision-maker. That bought the Spaniards time. Time was the true currency of Cajamarca. Every hour without a coordinated response increased the Spaniards' ability to stabilize their position. Every day allowed them to reshape relationships, intimidate potential challengers, and learn how to manipulate the system they had just disrupted. But this phase was not secure. Spanish numbers had not changed. Inca strength had not disappeared. The only thing holding the environment together was the belief that Atahualpa's fate was undecided. This created a fragile equilibrium. Execution had succeeded tactically. Strategically, the outcome was still unresolved. The plan had achieved its rupture. It had not yet achieved control. And that distinction matters. Because from this point forward, the Spaniards were no longer executing a plan. They were improvising within a space their plan had violently opened. Which brings us to the most revealing phase of all. Not what the Spaniards did next, but how the Inca system responded, and why that response was fatally misaligned with the moment. Because the real collapse did not happen in the square. It happened in the decisions that followed. The most revealing part of Cajamarca is not the ambush. It is what did not happen afterward. An empire with vast manpower, intact logistics, and overwhelming numerical superiority did not crush a trapped foreign force. It paused. It waited. It negotiated. And in doing so, it surrendered the initiative it still possessed. This was not cowardice. It was structure. The Inca response to Cajamarca followed its internal logic precisely, and that logic was misaligned with the crisis it faced. Once Atahualpa was captured, the immediate tactical environment demanded decentralized initiative. Rapid concentration of force. Autonomous action by field commanders. Escalation without permission. But the Inca system was not built for that kind of response. Authority did not diffuse under pressure. It froze. Commanders outside Cajamarca did not know whether acting independently would save the emperor or doom him. They did not know whether violence would violate ritual order. They did not know whether Atahualpa still ruled, or whether his captivity suspended legitimacy altogether. Uncertainty paralyzed action. From the Spanish perspective, this paralysis was the hidden victory condition. Pizarro did not need the Inca to collapse. He only needed them to hesitate long enough for leverage to compound. Atahualpa's first reaction reinforced this dynamic. Rather than ordering immediate counterattack, he attempted to reassert control through negotiation. He offered ransom. He spoke as a sovereign managing a crisis, not as a captive triggering emergency doctrine. This choice is often judged harshly. It should not be. From Atahualpa's viewpoint, negotiation was rational. He still commanded loyalty. He still believed his authority functioned. He still expected that violence could be regulated through ritual and exchange. What he underestimated was the nature of the opponent. The Spaniards were not trying to restore equilibrium. They were exploiting delay. Here lies the first misfire. The Inca system interpreted Cajamarca as a diplomatic rupture that could be repaired. The Spanish system interpreted it as a strategic opening that had to be widened immediately. These interpretations were incompatible. While negotiations unfolded, Spanish forces stabilized their control. They learned internal hierarchies. They identified factions. They assessed who could be co-opted, who could be intimidated, and who could be eliminated later. Time was not neutral. It was asymmetric. The second misfire lay in threat perception. To the Inca elite, the Spaniards were still numerically insignificant. Dangerous, yes. Disruptive, yes. But not an existential military force. The empire had weathered internal war far bloodier than this encounter. That perception prevented immediate annihilation. What was not understood was that the Spaniards were no longer operating as a military unit. They were operating as a political infection. Their power did not scale with numbers. It scaled with access to legitimacy and coercion. Doctrine blinded the response. The Inca had no conceptual framework for an enemy whose primary weapon was the manipulation of authority itself. Their experience taught them that enemies either rebelled openly or submitted. Cajamarca did neither. The third misfire came from overconfidence in structural stability. The Inca system had survived succession crises, internal rebellions, and regional resistance. It had always reasserted control. That history created a dangerous assumption that disruption would resolve itself if the center remained intact. But the center was no longer intact. It was captive. Yet even captivity did not immediately register as collapse. Atahualpa was alive. Alive meant continuity. Alive meant patience might still pay off. This assumption delayed decisive action. There was also a psychological dimension that cannot be ignored. Violence at Cajamarca was shocking not only in scale, but in form. It violated expectations of how power encounters were supposed to unfold. That shock created cognitive overload. People default to familiar scripts under overload. For the Inca, that script was ritual resolution, not uncontrolled escalation. The Spaniards understood this instinctively. They did not escalate indiscriminately at first. They maintained Atahualpa as a visible focal point. They allowed the system to believe it was still negotiating with itself. This was not mercy. It was strategy. The fourth misfire was structural rigidity in communication. Orders flowed downward. They did not circulate laterally. Field commanders were not trained to coordinate independently at scale. Waiting for clarity was safer than acting incorrectly. But clarity never came. Atahualpa's captivity created a feedback loop. The more leaders waited for instruction, the more effective the captivity became. The Spaniards did not need to issue counterorders. They simply needed to prevent legitimate orders from emerging. This is the point of break most accounts miss. The Inca did not lose because they were weaker. They lost because their system required certainty at the exact moment uncertainty dominated. Meanwhile, Spanish misinterpretations did occur. Pizarro's men overestimated their control at several moments. They mistook hesitation for submission. They believed fear would translate into obedience indefinitely. That belief would later prove false. But in the immediate aftermath, the misalignment was fatal. The Inca response was measured, controlled, logical within its worldview. It was also precisely what the Spanish strategy required. Cajamarca succeeded not because the Spaniards predicted every move, but because the Inca system reacted according to rules that no longer applied. This is the uncomfortable lesson. Systems fail not when they abandon their principles, but when they apply them too faithfully to situations they were never designed to handle. The capture of Atahualpa did not end the war. It ended the possibility of a coordinated response at the moment coordination mattered most. And once that moment passed, the cost of recovery multiplied rapidly. Which brings us to the final accounting. Because even a successful unorthodox strategy leaves behind wreckage, and Cajamarca's price was not paid only by the defeated. To understand the full meaning of this decision, we must confront what it achieved, and what it destroyed in the process. Cajamarca produced an outcome that looked decisive on the surface and corrosive beneath it. In the immediate sense, the Spanish achieved what their plan demanded. Atahualpa was neutralized as an independent actor. The Inca command system stalled. Time shifted from enemy to asset. A force that should have been destroyed within days instead entrenched itself politically and psychologically. But this was not a clean victory. It was a controlled collapse with consequences that unfolded unevenly and violently. The first outcome was strategic leverage, not territorial control. By holding Atahualpa alive, the Spaniards turned captivity into a negotiating instrument. Ransom was offered. Promises were made. Compliance was extracted incrementally. Each concession reinforced the illusion that equilibrium could be restored through exchange. That illusion mattered. It kept the Inca system in a state of suspended response. As long as Atahualpa remained a potential sovereign rather than a fallen one, decisive retaliation felt premature. This bought the Spaniards weeks they had no right to possess. Yet this leverage carried a built-in expiration date. The longer captivity lasted, the more the contradiction became impossible to manage. Authority cannot function indefinitely from a cell. Legitimacy decays when orders are delayed, filtered, or contested. Rivalries sharpen. Local leaders begin to test boundaries. This leads to the second outcome, fragmentation. Cajamarca did not instantly destroy the Inca state. It fractured it. Loyalty became conditional. Obedience became hesitant. Violence became localized rather than coordinated. The Spaniards exploited this not through overwhelming force, but through selective intervention. They did not try to rule the empire at once. They inserted themselves into disputes, rewarded compliance, punished resistance, and let internal tensions do the work of erosion. This is the part often misread as inevitability. It was not inevitable. It was cultivated. The third outcome was moral corrosion. The capture of Atahualpa established a precedent that poisoned every interaction that followed. Trust was no longer possible. Negotiation became performance. Agreements were provisional tools rather than binding commitments. When Atahualpa was eventually executed, the immediate strategic rationale was clear: he had become a liability. Alive, he unified uncertainty. Dead, he removed a focal point. But strategically clean decisions are not ethically neutral. His death erased the last illusion of continuity and replaced it with raw coercion. The Spaniards lost the leverage of legitimacy and gained the burden of ruling through fear and force. This shift mattered. It intensified resistance. It hardened identities. It ensured that control would be contested violently rather than negotiated. What had begun as a surgical strike against authority became an open-ended occupation. The human cost escalated rapidly. Cajamarca itself involved the killing of thousands of unarmed attendants. That violence was not incidental. It was intrinsic to the shock effect the strategy required. The deaths created paralysis. They also created trauma that would echo through every subsequent engagement. Beyond the square, the cost multiplied. Civil structures broke down. Power vacuums invited exploitation. Communities were forced to choose between collaboration and destruction. The initial efficiency of the strategy gave way to sustained brutality. This is the hidden price of unorthodox strategies that target systems rather than forces. They tend to collapse order faster than they can replace it. There was also a psychological cost to the perpetrators. Pizarro and his officers crossed a threshold at Cajamarca that could not be uncrossed. They had weaponized ritual. They had converted diplomacy into a kill mechanism. From that moment on, every negotiation carried the shadow of betrayal. This narrowed their future options. Once trust is destroyed at a structural level, control must be maintained through surveillance, intimidation, and repeated violence. Strategic flexibility decreases, even as dominance appears to increase. Finally, there is the counterfactual that haunts Cajamarca. What if the capture had failed? What if Atahualpa had escaped? What if the square had turned into a massacre of Spaniards instead? The answer is not a narrow defeat. It is immediate annihilation. Cajamarca was a strategy with zero tolerance for error. Its success retroactively makes it appear calculated. In reality, it was balanced on assumptions that could not be verified in advance. That does not diminish its strategic brilliance. It defines its danger. Unorthodox strategies do not forgive miscalculation. They amplify it. Cajamarca achieved its immediate objective. It did not produce stability. It produced dominance at the cost of legitimacy, speed at the cost of endurance, and leverage at the cost of moral authority. These trade-offs are not incidental. They are structural. Which forces us to confront the final question. If Cajamarca succeeded by breaking the rules, what does it actually teach us about strategy, and when, if ever, such a decision should be made again? Because understanding this decision means understanding where strategy ends and something darker begins. Cajamarca is often remembered as an act of audacity. That description is incomplete. Audacity explains nerve, not structure. What Cajamarca reveals is something colder, a method for attacking power without fighting its instruments. At its core, this strategy was not about violence. It was about priority. Pizarro identified what mattered most in the Inca system and ignored everything else. Armies, logistics, territory, morale, all secondary. The primary objective was authority itself. This reframes Cajamarca as a lesson in system targeting. Most military thought focuses on degrading capacity. Cajamarca focused on disabling permission. When permission to act is centralized, removing the source of permission halts action even when capacity remains intact. Soldiers do not move because they are unsure whether movement is legitimate. This is the first principle Cajamarca exposes. Principle 1. When authority is centralized, legitimacy is a single point of failure. Cajamarca did not collapse the Inca state by force. It suspended its ability to decide. The paralysis was not fear alone. It was uncertainty about who had the right to authorize violence. The second principle is more uncomfortable. Principle 2. Ritualized order creates predictable behavior under stress. Rituals are designed to manage power peacefully. They also create constraints that can be inverted. Cajamarca weaponized predictability. It turned a space designed to limit violence into the exact place violence could not be anticipated. This is not a general endorsement of deception. It is a warning about environments where formality substitutes for contingency. The third principle concerns risk. Principle 3. Unorthodox strategies compress risk rather than reduce it. Cajamarca did not mitigate danger. It concentrated it. All uncertainty was forced into a single moment. Success resolved everything. Failure ended everything. There was no gradient. This kind of strategy is not scalable. It is not replicable at will. It requires a rare overlap of desperation, misperception, and structural vulnerability. Most attempts would fail catastrophically. This is why Cajamarca should not be taught as a template. It should be studied as a boundary case. There is also a negative lesson that must be confronted. Cajamarca demonstrates that strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy can diverge completely. A decision can be coherent, decisive, and transformative, and still poison the environment it creates. The collapse of trust was not a side effect. It was intrinsic. Once ritual is betrayed, it cannot be repaired. Every subsequent interaction becomes coercive by default. That narrows future choices and accelerates violence. So what does Cajamarca actually say about strategy? It says that strategy is not just about defeating enemies. It is about choosing which rules you are willing to destroy in order to survive. And once destroyed, those rules do not return. This is why Cajamarca remains controversial centuries later. Not because it was clever, but because it worked by turning the foundations of order into weapons. And that is a power that does not stay contained. The final lesson is the most sobering. Cajamarca was not the triumph of foresight. It was the acceptance of consequences. Pizarro did not choose a path because it was clean or sustainable. He chose it because all other paths led to extinction. That distinction matters. Unorthodox strategies are not about brilliance. They are about thresholds. About the moment when survival demands decisions that permanently alter the landscape of legitimacy. Cajamarca crossed that threshold. And once crossed, there was no return. Which is why this episode is not a celebration of ingenuity, but an examination of what strategy becomes when the rules themselves are treated as expendable. Cajamarca forces an uncomfortable conclusion. The Spanish did not win because they were stronger. They won because they identified a structural vulnerability and accepted a moral cost most commanders would refuse. They attacked authority, not force. They froze a system that depended on permission at the exact moment permission mattered most. But this kind of victory carries inertia. Once legitimacy is seized through betrayal, it must be maintained through domination. Once ritual is weaponized, trust becomes a liability. The strategic horizon narrows. Violence becomes maintenance rather than exception. Cajamarca is often framed as the beginning of conquest. It is more accurate to see it as the beginning of an irreversible condition. A moment where power shifted from negotiated order to enforced compliance. That shift reshaped everything that followed. For strategy, Cajamarca is not a lesson in cleverness. It is a warning about thresholds. About the point where survival logic overrides institutional restraint. About decisions that solve one problem by creating a deeper, longer one. This is why Cajamarca still matters. Not because it can be repeated, but because it reveals how systems fail when legitimacy is treated as a switch rather than a process. And in every era, there are moments when someone considers flipping that switch. In the next unusual campaign, we will examine another decision that rewrote the rules and left behind consequences no one could fully control.